If you look down at Earth from space, you will see there on the Asian continent the Qilian Mountains rising like a colossal knot, radiating outward in every direction to give birth to nearly all of Asia's greatest mountain ranges: the Himalayas, the Kunlun, the Tian Shan, the Hindu Kush. These ranges carve Asia into worlds utterly unlike one another. A world of wet monsoons, a world of arid interior, a world of frozen tundra. And slicing through all these geographical divides is a single passage, so narrow it barely registers as a line on the map, that nonetheless changed the course of an entire continent. It is called the Hexi Corridor. The name may sound unfamiliar, but its meaning in English, the Hexi Corridor, or to put it even more plainly, the corridor west of the Yellow River, already reveals its essence: a corridor, a passage, a bridge. It stretches from the Wuxiaoling Ridge in the east to the Jade Gate Pass in the west. At its narrowest point, it is merely a few dozen kilometers across. To the south rises the Qilian Mountains, 4,000 to 5,000 meters high, capped with perpetual snow. To the north stand the Longshan Mountains, the Haley Mountains, and beyond them the Anxi Plateau and the Tang Desert. This is the corridor that, for over 2 millennia, has played the most subtle role in the geopolitics of Asia. It has been a barrier and a gate, a fortress for defenders to hold, and a starting point for explorers heading west. To put it in terms of modern geopolitics, in the age of land power, its importance was comparable to the Alpine passes. In the age of sea power, it is comparable to Panama, Suez, and Malacca. The story we are about to tell is the story of how this corridor became part of China, and how that fact is inextricably tied to China's strength, both in history and in the present day. Look across the millennia of Chinese dynastic history. During its 3 great eras of Pax Sinica, China controlled the Hexi Corridor without exception, and through it controlled the routes into Central Asia and the West. Had China lost the Hexi Corridor, the central dynasties would have, in essence, lost their grip over what is today Xinjiang, Tibet, Qinghai, and even much of Gansu. That means at least 4 million square kilometers carved out of China's current 9.6 million. It would have been cut off almost entirely from the Central Asian and Indian plates. It would have been reduced to a relatively inward-looking, conservative regional power, not the Eurasian-spanning superpower it is today. Let us begin with 2 frontier passes. In classical Chinese poetry, 2 passes appear so often that they have long transcended their geographical coordinates and become cultural symbols etched deep into the civilization. The Jade Gate, the Yang Gate. If you travel through northwestern China today, you can still see their ruins. They are crumbling walls of rammed yellow earth, standing alone in the depths of the Gobi, nearly 100 kilometers from the nearest city of Dunhuang. They look so desolate, so utterly isolated, that it is hard to imagine that for centuries upon centuries, this was among the busiest thoroughfares in the world, a mandatory passage for soldiers, merchants, monks, and envoys. For 2,000 years, countless Chinese poets have written melancholy verses about them. What those poems describe is not merely one departure or another. They capture the complex emotion of an entire civilization, Chinese civilization, as it faced its western frontier. Longing, fear, boldness, melancholy, all woven together. In the words of the 20th century geopolitician Halford Mackinder, the interior of the Eurasian continent, what he called the heartland, roughly corresponding to what we commonly refer to as Central Asia and the Western regions, is the core of the world island. Whoever controls the heartland controls the world island. Whoever controls the world island commands the destiny of the world. And the Hexi Corridor, that is the arm Chinese civilization stretched toward this heartland. Before the Han Dynasty, the central dynasties knew almost nothing of this corridor. It was occupied by nomadic peoples, the Yuji, the Wusun, and later the Xiongnu, who came to dominate the steppe. For the agriculturalists of the Yellow River Basin, the Hexi Corridor meant danger. Xiongnu cavalry swept down from it, plundered the borderlands, and then vanished beyond the northern horizon. But in the 2nd century BC, the defense imperative of an agrarian empire desperate to defeat its nomadic northern neighbor, and the ambition of a young emperor changed everything. That emperor was Liu Che, known to posterity as Emperor Wu of Han. In 141 BC, not yet 16 years old, he ascended the throne and went on to rule the empire for more than half a century. Barely 2 years into his reign, he dispatched the legendary envoy Zhang Qian westward into the western regions. Zhang Qian's journey lasted over a decade. He narrowly escaped death again and again, and finally fulfilled his emperor's mission. He not only passed through the Hexi Corridor and reached the western regions, he traversed what is today Xinjiang, crossed the Pamirs, and arrived at the Fergana Valley and the lands of the Hellenistic Greco-Bactrian kingdom. He found the Yuji, but the Yuji no longer wished to fight. They had settled on that fertile land and built a comfortable life. The plan to ally with them against the Xiongnu failed. Yet what Zhang Qian brought back to the Han court was worth far more than a military alliance. He brought back a world. He brought back a startling picture. West of the Xiongnu, beyond the deserts and the snow-capped mountains, was neither the end of the world nor a barbaric wasteland. There were dozens of city-states and kingdoms, large and small: Shule, Khotan, Kucha, Karasar, Lulan. They had walls, they had farmland, they had markets, they had armies. Some of these states even boasted populations in the tens of thousands. And the only connection to them, that was the Hexi Corridor. If the Han Empire could seize the Hexi Corridor, it could do 3 things. First, sever the Xiongnu's link to the western regions, depriving them of resources and allies in the west. Second, open a path for the Han Empire into the western regions, gaining war horses, goods and allies, and geographically enveloping the Xiongnu. Third, once established in the Hexi Corridor, it could thoroughly suppress any potential alliance between the Xiongnu and the Qiang tribes to the south. So from roughly 124 BC to 119 BC, Emperor Wu threw the full weight of his empire into the war, launching 3 decisive campaigns against the Xiongnu. In the end, at immense cost, the Hexi Corridor was won. Emperor Wu then established 4 commanderies there. The name of each commandery was carefully chosen. Each was a declaration of imperial will. Wu Wei, displaying martial might. This was the eastern gateway to the corridor, the first station of Han military power entering the passage. Changye, extending the arm of the state, to spread open the arm of the nation, reaching far into the distance. Juchuan, wine spring. Legend ties this name to the young general Huo Qubing, who is said to have poured an emperor's gift of wine into a spring so his entire army could share it. Dunhuang, grand and glorious. This was the westernmost of the four, the forward outpost of the Han Empire stretching toward the western regions. On the foundation of these four commanderies, Emperor Wu built two frontier passes at the western end of the Hexi Corridor, the Jade Gate and the Yang Gate. These passes were not sited arbitrarily. The Gobi west of Dunhuang was known as the White Dragon Mounds, the most treacherous stretch on the eastern edge of the western regions. Water was scarce, sandstorms were frequent, and it was easy for men and horses to lose their way. But once you made it through the White Dragon Mounds, you entered the first oasis of the western regions, Lulan. The Jade Gate controlled the northern route to Lulan. The Yang Gate commanded the southern route. Together they were like two locks, sealing the western door of the Hexi Corridor. Hold these two passes, and you held the entire corridor. And if you wanted to expand westward from the corridor, these passes had to be your starting point. On the maps of the Han Empire at its height, the Jade Gate and the Yang Gate marked the very edge of the civilized world. That is not to say there was no civilization beyond them. We already know there were flourishing city-states in the western regions. Rather, in the self-conception of the Han Empire, these two passes were the dividing line between order and wilderness, between home and a foreign land. When an official set off for his post in the western regions, when a soldier marched out to man the frontier, when a merchant embarked upon the Silk Road, this was where they would turn their heads eastward one last time. And with that look, they took in the whole of the Han Empire. Behind them lay the farmland and beacon towers of the four commanderies of the Hexi Corridor. Further east, the palaces of Chang'an and the chimney smoke of home. Ahead of them lay the unknown desert and the western regions, still waiting to be opened. The deepest significance of the Hexi Corridor is this: it was a door. And beyond that door lay the western regions. In the Chinese historical context, the western regions has both a narrow and a broad definition. The narrow meaning roughly corresponds to today's Xinjiang. The broad meaning encompasses the far deeper interior of Central Asia, even reaching Persia and India. To the people of the Han Dynasty, the western regions was, above all, a mosaic of dozens of small city-states, what we would today call oasis states. At the center of the Tarim Basin lies the Taklamakan, China's largest desert, so parched that it was nearly impassable. But melting snow from the Tian Shan and the Qilian Mountains formed a ring of oases along the desert's edge, and each oasis sustained a city-state. Shul, Khotan, Kucha, Karasar, Lulan. You may have heard these names elsewhere. They were the jewels of the Silk Road, and they were the prize over which the Han Empire and the Xiongnu contended. These city-states shared one defining trait. They were too weak to survive on their own. When a powerful nomadic empire, like the Xiongnu, bore down from the north, they had no choice but to submit, to pay tribute, and to provide troops. But when that nomadic empire weakened, they would, quite naturally, look for a new protector. Seizing the Hexi Corridor gave the Han Empire the possibility of becoming the master of the western regions. But to truly secure a foothold there, it needed something more durable. It needed a way to extend the Hexi Corridor outward. It needed a route that soldiers, envoys and merchants could travel in safety. And so the Han Great Wall was extended westward. The beacon towers built along this extension were strung like a chain of beads, reaching from Dunhuang westward through the White Dragon Mounds all the way to Lop Nur. Smoke signals by day and beacon fires by night could transmit messages from the western regions to Chang'an in an extremely short time. The stations and posts along the wall were garrisoned with soldiers and stocked with grain and water. They provided protection and supplies to passing diplomatic missions and merchant caravans. Along these routes, the Han postal relay system was also in operation. Official documents, intelligence, and decrees moved back and forth along this chain of beacon towers. The extension of the Great Wall meant that the Han Empire was pushing that passageway called the Hexi Corridor further and further westward as time went on. By 60 BC, in the royal courts of the western regions, Han envoys were increasingly seen as the men with the power to decide. This vast land no longer needed expeditionary armies. It needed an institution to manage its daily affairs. That year, the Han Empire decreed the establishment of the Protectorate of the Western regions. The Protector General was the plenipotentiary representative of the Han central government stationed in the western regions. Once established, the Protectorate oversaw the construction of beacon towers and post roads, set up tributary states and military agricultural colonies, mediated disputes between kingdoms, and, when necessary, mobilized the forces of various states to resist foreign enemies and put down rebellions. The Protector General had the authority to appoint and depose rulers and officials below the rank of king. This was the first administrative body in Chinese history whose jurisdiction encompassed all of present-day Xinjiang and parts of Central Asia. If we compare the Han Empire to ancient Rome, the Protector General in the western regions was somewhat like a provincial governor, holding simultaneous authority over military command, diplomatic representation, and certain judicial powers. But the territory he administered was not a province directly ruled by Rome. It was a constellation of client states that paid tribute and pledged allegiance to Rome. The Protector General did not directly tax the people of the western regions, nor did he alter their laws or customs. What he upheld was Han's suzerainty over the region. He ensured the trade routes remained open, that the various kingdoms did not attack one another, and that no force, particularly the Xiongnu, could regain control. From this moment on, the vast western regions, including most of present-day Xinjiang and portions of Central Asia, were for the first time politically linked to the Central Plains dynasties. At the time, this connection may not have been marked on any map in the modern sense, but in the official documents of the Han dynasty and in the minds of its people, the Protector General's jurisdiction was the boundary of Han imperial power. The lands east and south of Lake Balkhash thus began a historical process of sustained influence from the political culture of the Central Plains. This was the direct consequence of holding the Hexi Corridor. Without that corridor, the armies, envoys, princesses, and protectors of the Han could never have gone out. Without that corridor, the history of the western regions might well have taken an entirely different path. The Protectorate of the Western Regions, established in 60 BC, snapped like a string during the violent transition between the Western and Eastern Han dynasties. Wang Mang usurped the Han throne, and the realm descended into chaos. The Central Plains dynasty had its hands full. The Protectorate became little more than an institution on paper. The Xiongnu returned, filling the power vacuum left by the Han withdrawal. During the Eastern Han, the Hexi Corridor was twice reopened, and operations in the western regions were twice restored. But after that, the Central Plains once again fractured. The three kingdoms, the Wei, the Jin, and the southern and northern dynasties, 3 centuries of upheaval. The Hexi Corridor and the western regions were like kites with snapped strings, drifting further and further from the memory of the Central Plains courts. But the Hexi Corridor was never forgotten. Far from being forgotten, during those 3 centuries, it became a sanctuary of a special kind. As the Central Plains fell apart, waves of population moved westward, pouring into the Hexi Corridor. They brought with them the Confucian classics, agricultural techniques, and the foundations of Han culture. At the very same time, Buddhism was flowing along the very same corridor in the opposite direction, from west to east. 2 civilizations met in the Hexi Corridor. So when China was reunified and rose to strength once again in the 7th century, the Hexi Corridor was no longer a purely military passageway. It had become a crucible of civilizations, a land where Han and Buddhist cultures, farming and herding, east and west, deeply intermingled. The newly unified dynasty was called the Tang. The Tang Empire was the most open and self-assured dynasty in Chinese history. Its imperial family itself carried steppe blood. The Li clan had intermarried with the Xianbei and the Turks for generations. They understood the nomadic world intuitively, and they instinctively harbored curiosity and tolerance toward foreign cultures. The great sovereign Li Shimin, Emperor Taizong, went on the offensive, projecting Tang power across the entire Tarim Basin and even into far Transoxiana. During the Yumenguan reign, Tang forces successively conquered Gaochang, Karasar, and Kucha, and received the submission of Khotan and Shulei. The ancient route of the Hexi Corridor was thoroughly reopened, and the banners of the Central Plains dynasty once again flew over the oases of the western regions. This time, the institution the Tang established in the western regions was larger in scale, more concentrated in power, and longer lasting than the Han Protectorate of the western regions. It was called the Protectorate General to Pacify the West. The Protectorate General was formally established in 640 AD. It was an institution that simultaneously held military, political, and civil authority. What it administered directly were not tributary states, but 4 strategic garrison towns known as the 4 garrisons of the pacified West: Kucha, Karasar, later replaced by Suyab, Khotan, and Shulei. These were 4 fortified cities garrisoned with standing armies, elite troops drawn from every corner of the Tang Empire. They were 4 nails driven deep into the interior of the western regions, bases from which the Tang military could strike in any direction at any moment. At its zenith, the political reach of the Protectorate General extended all the way to the shores of the Aral Sea. Suyab, in present-day Central Asia, is said by some to be the birthplace of Li Bai, and though historians still debate this claim, it perfectly captures the texture of that era. China's greatest poet may have had blood ties to the most remote frontier of the western regions, and no one thought this was strange in the slightest. At the same time, the corridor connecting the Protectorate General to Chang'an, the Hexi Corridor, entered a golden age. The emotional register of the Jade Gate and the Yang Gate quietly transformed. These were no longer places of tearful farewells. They were distant horizons that poets yearned toward. There were military glories to be won, adventures to be had, exotic wines and landscapes to savor, and the thrill of fighting shoulder to shoulder with Turkic warriors. Because the Tang was an outward-looking dynasty, its strength was built on firm control of the Hexi Corridor and the western regions. When a dynasty commands the passage into the heart of the world with full confidence, its intellectuals and soldiers no longer regard the frontier as a place of dread. They treat it as a stage. In that era, the Jade Gate and the Yang Gate were no longer just the doorstep of home. They were also the starting line. With this open-mindedness, the Hexi Corridor functioned not only militarily and politically. It became the veritable heart of civilizational exchange across the entire Central Asian world. Of course, the brilliance of the High Tang had its limits. The Hexi Corridor and the Protectorate General to pacify the West sustained Tang control over the western regions. But that control required an uninterrupted supply of manpower, wealth, and military force. When those resources were diverted, everything wavered. In 755 AD, the An Lushan Rebellion erupted. It was the greatest internal rebellion in the history of the Tang Empire. The rebel armies drove straight for Chang'an. The Tang court had no choice but to urgently withdraw the cream of its forces from the Protectorate General to return and save the emperor. The defenses of the western regions were gutted overnight. The Tibetan Empire, a rising power on the Qinghai Tibet Plateau, seized the opportunity with sharp reflexes. Its forces marched north through the Qilian Range, severed the Hexi Corridor, and then, over the following decades, gradually swallowed up the garrison towns of the Protectorate General one by one. The Tang Empire's connection to the western regions was completely severed. The last defenders of the Protectorate General, in Kucha, in their isolated city, held out for decades, fighting until the very last man, waiting for reinforcements that never came. The Tang Empire ultimately collapsed. The 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period followed, another age of chaos. Then came the Song dynasty. The Song was a period of spectacular economic and cultural achievement in Chinese history. But territorially, it was a period of contraction. To its north, it faced the Khitan Liao, the Tangut Western Xia, and the Zhuchen Jin. The entire Hexi Corridor was under the control of the Western Xia. The Song dynasty never once held that corridor. Not for lack of wanting to, but for lack of ability. What did this mean? It meant the Song's strategic orientation was forced to shift toward the sea. The maritime Silk Road flourished as never before during the Song. Quanzhou, Guangzhou, and Mingzhou became some of the busiest ports in the world. The center of gravity of Chinese foreign trade shifted from northwestern camel caravans to southeastern sailing ships. This did not weaken China, but it profoundly altered its geographical outlook. For a period, the eyes that once looked west were closed. Then came the Mongols. The Yuan dynasty was an exception so vast it took the breath away. The Mongol Empire was itself the product of conquest from the steppe to the west. In this period, the Hexi Corridor lost its meaning as a frontier and became simply an ordinary passage within an enormous empire. Marco Polo walked into China along this very road. But for the rulers of the Ming and Qing dynasties that followed, the legacy of the Yuan was complicated. It reaffirmed the importance of the Hexi Corridor, but also served as a reminder that the power controlling this corridor could move from east to west, but just as easily the other way around. After the Ming dynasty was founded, its military focus remained firmly on the northern steppe. The remnants of the Yuan retreated beyond the frontier, but continued to pose a persistent threat. The Ming response was to build the Great Wall as we know it today, stretching from Shanhai Pass by the Eastern Sea all the way to Jiayu Pass in the west. Take note of that western terminus, Jiayu Pass. It was situated several hundred kilometers further east than the Jade Gate and the Yang Gate of the Han and Tang. For most of the Ming era, Jiayu Pass marked the end of the empire's western frontier. Beyond the pass, in the western regions, the Ming had neither the will nor the strength to operate. This was a stark contrast to the Han and Tang. In Ming hands, the Hexi Corridor was treated far more as a defensive corridor than as one of expansion. Its role shifted from forward operating base to border barrier. The transformation was profound, but it did not erase the historical DNA of the Hexi Corridor. Those genes were merely waiting for the right moment to be reactivated. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the Qing dynasty's three great emperors, Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, launched a western campaign that would last nearly 100 years. The target was a new steppe power, the Dzungar Khanate. The Dzungars were a branch of the Oirat Mongols who controlled what is today Xinjiang and parts of Central Asia. Their cavalry threatened Qing rule from the west and coordinated with powers on the Qinghai Tibet Plateau. For the Qing, this was a familiar geopolitical setup, the very same configuration by which the Xiongnu had once used the Hexi Corridor to link the western regions with the Tibetan Plateau. History had performed a breathtaking echo, and the Qing response bore an uncanny resemblance to that of Emperor Wu of Han. The Qing forces first secured control over the Hexi Corridor, then used it as a springboard to advance step by step into the western regions. Kangxi defeated Galdan. Yongzheng consolidated Qinghai. Qianlong ultimately annihilated the Dzungar Khanate and incorporated the entire Tarim Basin into the Qing Empire. This land acquired, late in the dynasty, the name it retains today, Xinjiang, literally, the old territory newly returned. At the same time, the Qing accomplished something the Han and Tang had left unfinished. By defeating the Dzungar's allies on the Qinghai Tibet Plateau, the Qing established the office of the Amban in Tibet, bringing the plateau fully under effective administrative control. The geographical linkage between the Hexi Corridor and the northern Qinghai Tibet Plateau had been grasped by Emperor Wu of Han 2,000 years earlier. But it was not until the Qing that this link was finally transformed into a stable political integration. Do you remember the metaphor from our opening? The Hexi Corridor is like a suture line. By the time of the Qing, that line had at last sewn together all the plates that needed to be joined. Xinjiang, Tibet, Qinghai and Gansu tightly into one fabric. This is why we say that Emperor Wu's campaign to seize the Hexi Corridor opened up the possibility of more than 4 million square kilometers of Western territory for China. Today, the Hexi Corridor no longer needs to be summoned. It is simply part of China, indisputably as a matter of course. Trains leaving Lanzhou pass through the Wushaoling Tunnel and arrive in Dunhuang within hours. Expressways and gas pipelines run along the route of the ancient Silk Road, channeling the resources of Xinjiang eastward and sending the products of the East into Central Asia. But the shape of the corridor has not changed. To its north and south remain the snowy mountains and the deserts, and along its spine the oases remain the necessary path of civilizations. The Jade Gate and the Yang Gate are still places where tourists stop to take photographs, even if wind and sand have worn them down to broken stumps of rammed earth. A history of over 2,200 years unfolds. From the grand strategy of Emperor Wu to the openness of the High Tang, from the sedimentation of the chaotic centuries to the reintegration of the Qing era. The central thread is one and the same: how a single geographical passage shaped a political entity. Without the Hexi Corridor, the western frontier of the Han would most likely have stopped at the Yellow River. The oasis kingdoms of the western regions might never have had any institutional contact with the Central Plains. The path by which Buddhism entered China might have been entirely different. No Tang poems would have been written about the Jade Gate and the Yang Gate. The names Protectorate of the Western Regions and Protectorate General to Pacify the West would not appear in any historical record. More importantly, the outline of China's western territories today, Xinjiang, Tibet, Qinghai, Gansu, that possibility was activated at the moment Emperor Wu seized the Hexi Corridor. Mountains do not move. Deserts do not vanish. Oases do not shift their ground. The Hexi Corridor is there. Any strong dynasty with its capital in northern China, so long as it possessed enough strength, so long as it cast its eyes westward, would inevitably see that corridor. And then it would move along that corridor into the heart of Asia. The sand-laden winds still blow. The Qilian Mountains still stand. The corridor is still here. The Jade Gate stands silent in the setting sun, like a sentinel 2,000 years old. Its mission has long since ended, but it still stands there, reminding every passerby, this corridor opens onto the entire world.